Well, not really, because I think also that I could get a real conflict over here of teaching a comparative religion in public school.
I don't know what people would treat that like nowadays. When I was in school in 12th grade social studies, we had a unit on contemporary world problems. It was the whole class, and we talked about geographic problems and political problems and things like that. But there was a unit in there about a month on comparative religion, and we talked about all the major denominations in Christianity. We talked about all the major religions, you know, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, a little bit of Shinto, a little bit of Taoism, Christianity.
Guest speakers from those religions?
No, this was readings, and we covered like the differences between LDS, Catholicism, Protestantism. I don't think we did any discussion about either Pentecostalism or evangelicalism, but it did cover a ground, and it wasn't like anybody was preaching to anybody else. It's like, well, that's what these guys are doing. This is what these guys believe. That's what those guys over there believed, and it covered all the major religions. Now, today that might be politically pretty dicey to get into schools. I don't know, but I don't think any reasonable person would object if it's done in that kind of a manner. Yeah, well, I got a problem there sometimes.
That's the key. I'd like to make a comment as far as the schools go. When I was in school, I remember them telling us that the SAT scores had been going downhill, you know, and that the students before us were, you know, scoring much better on the tests. And I ended up going into a private school for 4 years of high school. Happened to be Catholic, was the only one available. Since I got out of school, I've heard that, you know, SAT scores have been going downhill, and they had to normalize them by adding 100 points, and they're still going downhill. And my opinion is that any time the government gets involved in the schools, you're going to have problems. I'm not too concerned about what there are bigger problems with the school system than whether or not they're teaching evolution or creation.
May I suggest that that's a topic for some other panel at some other convention? Yes.
You had a question?
Concerning the origin of the species, I haven't read the entire book, but I know that there's one section where Darwin specifically mentions that if his theory were true, that there would be millions and millions of transitional phases in the geological column or whatever. And you brought up the Cambrian explosion, and that's what we do see in the fossil record. We see complete organisms. Where are the transitional phases?
Let's talk about that.
Well, you can talk about that.
That's a good one. There are a couple of points here. As for the Cambrian explosion, that's, for one thing, it's relative. It didn't happen overnight. For another thing, it's no detraction from the theory of evolution to say that there were all the different phyla pretty much, or close to it, were there at the time. There's no law that you have to have the phyla developing since the Cambrian time. There are fossils before the Cambrian. You know, the Cambrian fossils themselves are extremely scarce as compared to later fossils. It kind of figures that the farther back in time you go, the longer the rocks have been there, the more wear and tear, let's say, they've suffered, not in the sense of erosion once they're buried, but they've been subjected to all kinds of forces. The obvious thing is that the earlier organisms tend to be small and soft-bodied. A lot of them did not have hard parts. But there are some wonderful Precambrian fossils. And here's the very good book by Stephen Jay Gould, among his other very good books, called Wonderful Life, the Burgess Shale and the History of Nature, about the Cambrian. I'm not hitting what you wanted.
Let me get to his point just briefly. The speciation thing that I mentioned, I didn't go into a lot of detail, but it somewhat indicates why you don't actually see what you can call transitional forms. You go back, you see the development, you see things that are different from one time to another time. No matter how many fossils you have fossil A and fossil B, there's a gap between them. When you fill that gap with a fossil, well, there's still a gap. Now there's two gaps. There's a gap between the 1 and 2 and between 3 and 4. So this gap business is somewhat meaningless. It's sometimes people call this the theory of the God of the gaps. In other words, we figure everything out, and then God is only there for the benefit of the gaps. But the fossil record is a little bit more like a movie with a lot of the frames missing. And you can still detect that motion occurred.
Would that be considered scientific then? If we define scientific method as something that is observable, something that we can reproduce and see, but we're missing this gap, so we can't see it, we can't prove it, so can we call that scientific?
Yes, you make
do.
inferences.
Okay.
We constantly do that in every aspect of life. We're constantly making inferences from the things we know to the things we don't know. There's one specific point about this particular problem I want to bring up, which is the tyranny of not just zoological, biological nomenclature. Every organism has to be given a scientific name, and the system of biological nomenclature was worked out to classify living organisms. So it's not all that well adapted to the fossil record, but we have to use it anyway because it's all we've got. So every time an organism is found, the discoverer, whether it's a fossil or something in the rainforest or whatever, the discoverer has got to decide, can I fit this into a known species, or do I create a new name for it, in which case it's a new species. And so every species has to be either A or B. It cannot, by the definition of the system, be an intermediate between them. But in fact, in real life, we do have all these intermediates. There are living species where you've got a whole, the classic case is the ring species, where you've got a lake or a mountain or something that a particular type of organism can't live on or in, but you've got a ring of subspecies going all the way around it of the same basic kind of critter. There's salamanders in California, I think it is, where you've got a whole string of subspecies. Each subspecies can interbreed freely with the next one or the ones on each side, but it has apparently gone around until you've got, probably not a complete ring, but a loop, a long string. The ones on the far ends cannot interbreed or do not interbreed, and so they appear to be separate species. So where do you draw the line? That's the thing.
We had two questions here. In the black shirt, I think you've been waiting the longest.